once you learn it or once you know about it and someone tells you what's going on, how could you not advocate for yourself and your family and your clients to be able to build and live in a healthy environment?
They're doing it because they're creating work that people desire, right? And they are just telling their clients, this is what you should do. It's a more resilient building, and it's a better building, and it's a healthier building. And so if I see them not waiting, I think that we can all not wait.
That's the magic of this kind of high performance thing, is like the synergies are just unbelievable once you get to a level of performance.
Hello and welcome to the Reimagine Edit, a special series of the Passive House podcast that shares curated insights from our experts in residence at the Reimagine Buildings Collective, our membership community of building professionals stepping up to tackle climate change. Today is March 3rd, 2025, and in this episode, we'll hear selected clips from Andrew Michler, Tim Locke, Ed May, Michelle Jacobson, and Maria Lomanto. I'm Zack Semke, Director of Passive House Accelerator and host of the Reimagine Buildings Collective, and a big thank you to you for tuning in. Let's dive right in, starting with Andrew Michler. Andrew has focused on high-performance building design and materiality since 1993. He's the author of the book Hyper-Localization of Architecture and the principal of the design group Hyperlocal Workshop. He's also co-founder of Passive House Rocky Mountains. He's experienced multiple fire events, including the 1991 Oakland Hills Fire and, in 2020, the Cameron Peak Fire, the largest wildfire in Colorado to date. He's currently working on the rebuilding effort for the Marshall Fire in Boulder County. He's also helping us to plan our next Reimagine Buildings Conference on March 14th, Designing for Fire Resilience, which is free to collective members. So Andrew's Ask Me Anything, centered on fire hardening, was timely. In this first clip, Andrew shares that there's more than meets the eye when it comes to fire resilience.
People get a little, I'm not going to say knee-jerk, but we get a little overly simplified when we talk about fire resilience in buildings. And so if you go into any group chat or YouTube video or something, everybody says, just build it out of steel studs and concrete and you'll be fine. And we found plenty of steel and concrete buildings that burn just as significantly as regular buildings in terms of the actual house itself. And it turns out that a lot of the ways the fire get in is really sneaky, very stealth. So once the fire gets inside of the building system, and especially inside the house itself, or the roof system, then you're in really bad shape, no matter what you clad your building with. Even if you do best practices around the structure itself, at times, you can still have a really vulnerable situation. We've seen that over and over again in my experiences in Colorado mountains where I live and built. And then I started in the Oakland Hills Fire in 91, where just everything burned, pretty much, no matter what Class A roof and stucco cladding was on it. So it's the details that count. And that seems to synergize really well with how we think around Passive House, more in systems approach rather than like individual approaches. So I think we have a really good mindset in Passive House to really take on the fire resilience scope as well as we're designing in areas that need more fire hardening.
As Andrew says, it's the details that count. Here, he lays out his most recent fire-resilient wall assembly.
We're using Eco-Cocoon straw panel, which is pretty much fire resilient in itself. It's about a 120-minute wall, which is pretty amazing. So it doesn't really hold fire just simply because it doesn't have, you can't carry oxygen within the wall system itself. But also, that's where I want to clad just blue board drywall on top of that, and then put my WRB over that. And I think it's funny that people get excited about that. It's straw, and we're putting WRBs right on top of straw. So drywall is less vulnerable than straw, especially if it's impregnated with some waterproofing content. So straw or cellulose or whatever your timber assembly is. And if you need a ply for shear, that's fine. We don't need a ply in the panelized system that we're using. Then we put a WRB on top. Then we put the drywall on top of that, and then we put a WRB on that, and then our air space, and then whatever our cladding system is on over that is a really excellent wall. I would say that's closer to any perfect wall, Americana style, that's being taught in most of the architecture and engineering schools that we have now. We have like really fireproof, vapor open, low carbon assemblies that should be able to easily be built by regular craftspeople, tradespeople, and simple to detail. So more to come.
So, what's a remaining area of fire vulnerability in Passive House? Andrew poses the question.
Where do you guys, when you have a passive house and you have fire coming and you've done all these things, you have all the right outside stuff, the windows, everything's done right. What's the vulnerable place still in a passive house, in a fire event? What's the most obvious and critical place where fire embers can easily get into the passive house?
Your ventilation system, right? Like your ERV.
Exactly. So a lot of us are using those EPS foam tubes to bring outside air into our buildings. So and then the foam cores are plastic. Holy shit, you get enough embers into that ventilation system and you have a pretty reasonable place for fire to take off with inside of your building. We're starting to look more into filter systems, especially on the exterior coming in, but also from the interior going out for the ventilation systems, like almost like pre-filters, but they're also spark arresters potentially as well.
We, of course, need those ERVs and HRVs in our buildings, as well as airtightness, not least of which to protect ourselves from smoke during wildfire smoke events.
I think code should 100% require airtightness below 1 and ER and HRVs by code. I think that should be a standard practice throughout the entire industry because we have zero control right now on air infiltration in our buildings. And code has done almost no actual building science around how it's being developed. And it's been completely corrupted by, and this is my AMA humble opinion, has been really corrupted by the furnace industry and by the building industry, and needs a complete overhaul in terms of air control for all sorts of reasons. But smoke is a big one, and energy efficiency and longevity of the building they all work together. That's the magic of this kind of high performance thing, is like the synergies are just unbelievable once you get to a level of performance.
That's the magic. Next up, we have Tim Locke and his Designing Beyond Passive House Ask Me Anything. Tim is management partner at the architecture firm Opal. He also sits on the main AIA board of directors, the AIA National Strategic Council, and is the co-chair of the main AIA Committee on the Environment. At Opal, he spearheads the practice's overall approach to building ecology and climate action. And he dives into that here.
We had to have a building ecology squad in the office, and it was like, all right, you're each going to take a topic. We're going to self-sort them into these five topics. Those 5 topics now have names within the office. So there's Habitable Planet, which is about emissions, global emissions. There's Circular Resources, which I think that's gained traction in recent years. Most people understand what that is. There's Protected Water Cycle. There's Healthy Ecosystems, and there's Healthy Communities. And so those were arbitrary selections to try to create buckets that we could sort criteria into. But I think what we found is that in any sustainability framework, those buckets are always arbitrary. Like they bump up against each other, they have overlaps, they intersect. That's where it gets really interesting. But the reason we grouped them that way was that they were scaled from a global problem, which is human-based carbon dioxide emissions or equivalent emissions, all the way down to hyper-local problems like the healthy communities that we either support or don't support within the buildings we design, right? So the smallest cohort, smallest community that's affected by a design project, and then scaled it in between, right? And that was a way to try to create a design problem out of a data problem. And I say this a lot, I might have said it when we all talked together with FastFest Accelerator a few months ago. I'm always in this kind of constant state of the designer needs to really accept more scientific method into their approach, but scientists need to accept more design approach into their methods as well. Let these things work together. And so we can create constants around the problem that we're trying to abstract and design. But our superpower is in design, right? Or at least for me, I'm an architect. And so I don't want to not make a design problem. Can I design this framework to be generative, to be beneficial, to be impactful? And can we get to 80% conservation like we did with energy in Passive House in all these other ways? And the answer might be no. Like, I don't know yet. Like, we've only really had it in the office for 2.5 years now. So we've had a few big projects that we can measure across that framework. But yeah, it's exciting to try. And I think that it's always exciting to see how we can do more, be more impactful by just doing less and using less.
That holistic approach and that striving to apply the frame of 80% improvement borrowed from Passive House to all aspects of ecological design are inspiring and necessary. But how are those values being disseminated across the industry and policymaking?
I find myself more and more leading into my design education from 2.5 decades ago as a way to kind of market these ideas in a more effective way than I ever thought I would in the middle of my career when I first started engaging with ecological design in a serious way. Like then I was like super excited about the data, but the more I got into that, I realized that was a smaller and smaller group, the more specific the data became. So I find myself for dissemination leaning more on design tools than on numbers. This is probably the wrong cohort for that, but I've found that it's pretty effective and can get a pretty large stakeholder group, say on a public project, on board with a highly sustainable set of criteria without having to scold or level set in ways that people think is scary or hard or costly. So I guess I really believe in the power of disseminating through example, and example being great transformative design when we're talking about buildings specifically. If we're talking about disseminating information amongst ourselves, say as a building and design industry, I think that we're at a point in history where if you're not open source with how you're acquiring your information, your data, and how you're deploying it, then you're more on the side of a gatekeeper than I would like to feel comfortable with. Like, I think the reason that we made that framework is because we wanted to share outwardly how that was successful for us. That's offered by creating those 5 criteria or 5 buckets was arbitrary, yes, as I said, and it was about community scale, but mostly it was me responding to what I was hearing back from clients is I'm really excited about doing something that's good ecologically, but I don't understand any of this. What's my way in? So if I diversified the criteria, then somebody who's really just mostly interested in their kids falling asleep in class in a school building can learn how that is potentially related to these other energy saving issues, right? That are totally foreign to them. And I wanted that to potentially be something that anybody could take to any client, to any person that they know, and advocate for the intersectionality of these criteria. And that it's really for everybody. It's for us all to feel healthy. It's for us all to feel safe. It's for us all to feel resilient. And that was long-winded, and I'm sorry, Eric, for that, but I think it's really a two-pronged thing, right? It's how we talk to each other and don't withhold our information that we're learning and be honest when we're wrong, and how we talk to the public in ways that aren't, I don't know, belittling of the knowledge base they have and using the tools at our discretion that are great motivators for change.
Tim was then asked about the role of AHJs, or authorities having jurisdiction, like building inspectors and code bodies, in driving change.
I will say personally, if you're asking me the question, it's not, to be totally honest, it's not something I think about a ton. I think that the average, if you think about like the average building, we see that continuing to get better. And it takes a vanguard of designers and stakeholders willing to go well beyond what's merely acceptable in order to continue to move that average. And I don't see a lot of evidence in history. I'm a kind of like, I like reading history. I like reading political history a lot. I like reading sociology a lot. There's not a lot of evidence of that average being the progressive vanguard, right? So if I think about an AHJ as something that we need to pull along, to me, I like to turn more to the public and create critical mass in my client groups as big a scales as they can to show that it's possible, so that the next project you can maybe have a case study that allows you to move that a little bit forward. I really, and I've said this in speaking engagements many times, like I know it's hard, and I'm not saying this is your issue necessarily at all specifically, but I think that waiting for the AHJs, and I know that's not what you're asking, is really a non-starter to me. It's building specifically, maybe not so much design, but building. The construction industry is, I think it was like a Forbes article a few years ago that said it's the most conservative, most least progressive industry in the entire country. And I'm talking about the US alone here. I don't know about other countries. I know I have people from other countries on the call. Hi, Lloyd. But I think that's an industry that's built on repetition, that's built on consistency, and is adverse to change. And it's up to us to show that it's possible as the vanguard. I have no expectation of the AHJs being part of that solution. I'm going to be totally blunt on the AMA today. I think it's up to us to make that a reality that then can be modeled. And we can use other models in other jurisdictions which have made significant advancements as well. But I know architects all over the country that are doing net zero passive house proximate projects that don't even understand passive house. They're colleagues of mine. Some of them are very famous award-winning architects. Some of them are working in the Deep South. Some of them are working in the Southwest areas where there's zero penetration to the AHJs, and they're doing it. And they're doing it because they're creating work that people desire, right? And they are just telling their clients, this is what you should do. It's a more resilient building, and it's a better building, and it's a healthier building. And so if I see that possible, I see them not waiting. I think that we can all not wait.
Totally agreed. Let's not wait. In this last clip from Tim, he shares the 4 aspects of a strong brand and considers how Passive House stacks up.
When we changed our name from Geologic to Opal, or split off Opal from Geologic, we had this big branding exercise, and we got we randomly had a client that was a big time marketing guy, and he was like willing to give us some free services, which is great. So we took him up on it. We went through this exhaustive kind of branding exercise, which was tiring. But the first thing he said still sticks with me. He's like, a good marketing approach is to find a brand idea. And this could be applied to anything. It could be like passive house, could be ecological design in general, architectural design in general, whatever, building in general. It has to be 4 things. It has to be big, it has to be simple, it has to be useful, and it has to be true. And if it's those 4 things, it's going to be great. And I think we do a terrible job, even within the passive house community, of selling that. It's like, and I'm not trying to be critical of passive house. It's what we do. All of our projects, we try to get to those goals. But is it a big enough idea that we can grow and change over time? Is it useful to us? Does it actually allow us to do the work we need to do within the collective on that idea? Is it simple enough for anyone to understand? Right? Like anyone, that's kind of what you're getting to with your question. Is it simple enough to understand how they benefit? And is it true? Yeah, we don't want to lead with data, but the data has to undergird it, or else it's going to be pretty clearly inauthentic very quickly. Right? And I try to think about that a lot when I think about messaging. It's like, how are we doing those 4 things? And I think you're right that it's something that definitely could be improved, and we could be probably a lot less tactical and a lot more strategic a lot of the time. We'd make better strides, I think.
Yeah, I so appreciate this addition to the conversation, Ranger. We have Hulu doing us disservices with the curse and like things that are almost taking what were our like buzzwords within our industry and turning them into curse words, for lack of a better word. And we need to turn that around on its head. Like forget passive. What does that even mean? What does comfort and health mean? What is, talk
Right.
a language that everyone understands. I love the 4 marketing secrets that you just shared with us, Tim, because that can just be applied in so many thought categories in so many ways.
That was Carmel Pratt there at the end, adding her thoughts. Thanks to Carmel for hosting the AMA with Tim when I was on a road trip with my family, and to Mary James for doing the same with Andrew's Fire Hardening AMA. Carmel would be doing her own Ask Me Anything on March 25th, by the way, so mark your calendars for that. Now let's pivot to Ed May's Modeling AMA. For those of you who don't know Ed, he's partner at Building Type, where he's become one of the country's most sought-after Passive House modelers and consultants. He's also technical advisor with Passive House Accelerator and the instructor of our PHPP modeling course here on the Collective, as well as our brand new Honeybee pH course that dives into using Honeybee pH within Rhino and Grasshopper to create powerful, accurate, and streamlined Passive House energy models. As Ed's AMAs always are, this week's was full of great tips and insights around high-performance building practice. This clip about FIAS's new Revive retrofit standard stood out.
I think that's one of the reasons why I am so bullish on the new FIAS retrofit standard. I really do think that is a very thoughtful and interesting new approach to designing passive buildings. So the new FIAS retrofit standard, the Revive standard, says don't do annual energy modeling, don't do daily peak load modeling. Instead, what you want to do is you want to simulate a power outage during a heat wave in summer and design your building for that. And then simulate a power outage during a cold Arctic blast in winter and design your building for that. And you have to balance those two survivability periods against a total life cycle carbon emissions cost. And so it's a completely new way of looking at a passive building that does away with annual energy calculations in favor of carbon emissions. And instead of those like daily peak loads or percent overheating, which were never really very satisfactory in terms of metrics, they're looking at these survivability metrics across these power outage peak weeks. And we can quibble with whether the peak weeks are peaky enough for a sort of 60 or 90-year projection, but I think it's at least heading us in the right direction to say this is the methodology, and then we can use that to really dial in the performance. And we have seen very positive results using that new framework on some projects so far. We found it to be really effective and really impactful for clients to see those peak week results. When we talk about annual energy performance, everybody's eyes glaze over a little bit. It's meaninglessly large to think about an entire year's energy consumption. But when you say this week, it's going to drop to 48 degrees inside your house, people are like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
I get it.
There's so much drama there.
So-
It makes it all real.
It's a much better story, right? And
Yeah.
people like stories. People respond to narratives and stories, not numbers. And so it's a much better story. Like it's a much more visceral and like tangible story that you can hold in your head about what happens during this like power outage period. And so we've actually found that that's a really useful framework. And so I would definitely recommend taking a look at that one. The trouble with that one, of course, is that it's brand new. So there's a ton of sharp edges and weirdnesses, and it probably needs to go through a year or two of like calibration. The tools are, let's say, in their earliest stages, and they're not terribly sophisticated or user-friendly in many ways. There's a lot of sort of bits that are missing and are a problem, but I'm very positive about it. I think it's absolutely leading us in the right direction, and I'm really impressed with the work that those guys have done so far on that. I think it's absolutely a great new direction for the sort of passive house methodology to move. And I'd like to see it expanded to new construction. I don't see any reason why that method is applied only to retrofits. In my estimation, that's a great way to do new construction as well, to apply those same framework, the same ideas, personally.
I couldn't agree more with Ed here. When it comes to buildings and climate, we need to be focused on 1, reducing their carbon emissions, and 2, making our buildings resilient to climate impacts. Revive directs its focus on those two things, and it's kind of a seismic shift. It's super important. Next up, we have highlights from the Healthy Interiors AMA with Michelle Jacobson and Maria Lomanto. Michelle's and Maria's work focuses on ensuring that the high-performance buildings we're creating are healthy inside. They're co-partners at the interior design firm Design GLXY, and both hold multiple certifications and leadership positions in the healthy and sustainable materials space. In this clip, they emphasize the importance of looking beyond VOCs when it comes to the materials choices we make for our projects. I started by asking, what mistake did they commonly see that we should try to avoid?
I don't know that I'd want to say it was a mistake, but the fact perhaps it's that you don't have all the education or all the tools. And the first thing I could think of, and only just because we came from KBIS out in Las Vegas, the Kitchen and Bath Show, where we were speaking with a new vendor of mineral paint. And I think the idea, and what's to their credit, the Sherwin-Williamses and the Benjamin Moores of the world, that those are generally the first two thoughts of, okay, we've got to put paint on the walls of our building. And I think many people don't realize that when they do choose or specify a standard brand paint, they're adding plastic to their walls. And so you have this beautiful passive house envelope or high performance building that you've built, and you're adding a paint that's adding a layer of plastic made with petroleum to your walls. And right away, even though many of these brands will say we're low VOC, sure, low VOC, but what are those paints made out of? And primarily they're made of microplastics. So right away, that's the first thing that you need to think about. You're going to put some type of a primer on the walls, and then you're going to put a paint or a wallpaper. And you want to start thinking about the very first thing you're going to put on those high performance walls. And one of those is to think about what paint or what wall material, wall selection, finish coat am I going to put on these walls? Do you want to add to that, Maria?
Yeah, I do. I would say, in addition to what Michelle said, two of the places where I always hate to say that something is a mistake. I think it's a learning opportunity.
You're both very diplomatic. I appreciate that.
Yes, and I am very aware that I'm just using diplomacy in that moment. But I think that what happens is that if you don't have, and I doubt that it happens with the people who are attending this, but thinking that removing VOCs is your goal, and that's what you're thinking about, and you're not thinking about particulate matter in addition to VOCs, can be problematic, because so many, and when you're talking with the clients and the end users, is that everybody now knows about VOCs. And so they stop there. Oh, remove VOCs from the space, our indoor air quality is taken care of. That's not accurate, because there's particulate matter, and as things are breaking down and going into the air that are microscopic that you can't see, you can't smell it, but you're still breathing it in, and it affects heart and lungs down the line. So attaching like the goals to VOC is, I think, one problematic approach. I'll use an example that pertains more to furniture because it's an easy one. It's like a low-hanging fruit. But when you're working with furniture that has polyurethane foam inside, that is slowly going to break down. And I've often fantasized of getting one of these super duper cameras and doing a video of what it looks like. And I don't know if you'd have to do it like with infrared light or something, but when somebody sits down, of what the particulate matter is that kind of makes a cloud when you sit down on that then you're breathing in. And I know now everybody's going to be creeped out when they sit down on a sofa, but there are things to do to remediate that. If you cannot afford to use GOTS certified latex or other materials inside because the costs get much higher, then you wrap it, you contain it. So there are things to do. So that's like one area that's just a great example. But even like finishes on cabinetry too. Like everything, like you have to think about it. The world is breaking down all the time. Vinyl is final, which we don't want to use, but everything else is slowly breaking down.
So just adding to that, I'll touch back on the paint again. When you put paint on walls, paint will generally break down with air, with sunlight, with temperature. And when you have that plastic, those microplastics in your paint on your walls, that's eventually going to be breaking down when there's changes in temperature, changes in time, or even hanging a picture on a wall that's been painted. When you're hammering or the temperature changes in a room with a paint with a plastic in it, you also get bubbling and you get peeling. And all of those, even though they're things we can touch and feel, when that's breaking down, all of these microscopic materials are coming into that air quality, that indoor air quality. So even though everything might look really beautiful, things are consistently breaking down. So for instance, with the paint, you might choose a mineral paint that actually is made of rocks, doesn't have any petroleum or plasticines in it, and it's bonding. It's making like a cement bond to the particular sheetrock that you might be using in a space. Or even if you're painting stone or brick or something like that, it will have a bond, but then it's not breaking down. It's as much as like picking up a stone and sort of being able to put it on the exterior of your wall. And there's no materials, there's no microscopic particles that are coming from it, and it will not break down. And it forms a really nice barrier that is not off-gassing, is not going to break down, and is not putting anything into the environment that is going to give somebody some type of respiratory issues, whether it could get in ears and eyes and noses and mouths, and whether a pet in the area or a child touching it, it's not going to harm them.
The discussion with Michelle and Maria included lots of detail on materials to use, what to avoid, and how to advance healthy materials practice. They had this advice for getting healthy materials incorporated into renovations.
Once you learn it, or once you know about it and someone tells you what's going on, how could you not advocate for yourself and your family and your clients to be able to build and live in a healthy environment?
Yeah. And appealing to the moms for their children when you're doing renovations is a certain way of getting healthier materials into the project, because they want to safeguard their children
And their pets.
and their pets.
Thank you to Andrew, Tim, Ed, Michelle, and Maria for sharing their insights with us this week. As always, these clips just scratch the surface, so if anything piqued your interest here, please do dive into the full replays of these sessions. And if you're not a member of Reimagine Buildings Collective, please join us. You'll get direct access to experts like these. You'll get to know them, ask your burning questions, and expand your mind and your practice by engaging with these thought leaders. Head over to reimaginebuildings.com to join. Speaking of joining the collective, I want to celebrate this week's new members. A big welcome to Deborah Little, Tim Locke, Aaron Platicha, Lloyd Alter, Zash O'Donnor, Franz Veltusian, Mike Fowler, Maria Lomanto, Michelle Jacobson, and Tom Bassett-Dilly. With that, thank you for listening to this fourth episode of the Reimagine Edit, a production of the Passive House podcast by Passive House Accelerator. As always, don't hesitate to DM me with anything Reimagine Buildings Collective related, what you'd like to see on the platform, any ideas you'd like to share. We're building this community with you and for you, so feedback is incredibly valuable. And don't forget to invite your friends and colleagues to join us. Thanks, and have a great week. Be well.